as the All-Ireland final comes fast down the tracks, we've decided to do our power rankings up until this point. So All-Ireland semi-finals and everything before that. And we'll do another one once Limerick and Waterford play and we see which destination is for the Liam McCarthy Cup. Should we just jump straight to it?
I'd say jump straight into it, yeah.
Yeah, less of the messing and horse it into me, as they say. Right, we'll start off with number 10 and number 9. Probably not a great shock to people that it's going to be Dublin and Laois, is it?
No, probably not. I tell you what though, the one question I'd have is, I'd love to have seen if these two played each other again later on in the championship. I really think that Laois needed that game the first day out. They looked very, very leggy, but then they looked a different team altogether against Clare. Could have pulled off a massive shock. Would have been interesting if they'd beaten Clare. If they'd beaten Clare, they're probably going to be looking at, closer to mid-table. But it would have been really interesting, I think, if these two played each other again. Dublin were fairly on point against them that night. They obviously didn't want any sort of repeat of last year. But I would have loved to see the two of them playing again. I think it would have been an awful lot tighter. And I think Laois probably would have been a bit more proactive in their tactics. I think they were trying to stay in the game and probably were fearful that they hadn't half as much preparation done as Dublin.
Don't think so. I think Dublin would have beaten them again. And Laois's
I'm not saying that Dublin wouldn't have beaten them again. I'm saying it would have been way tighter.
No, I don't think so. I don't think so. And the reason that is because Clare were walking away in that game in Nolan Park in the qualifiers, and then the red card completely changed the game. And Clare went inside themselves, or whatever it was. Now, Laois played really well, but I still don't think the gap would have been brought down massively by that. I think either way, in the heat of the hunt, we're still having Laois at 10 and Dublin at 9.
We are. The only thing I'll say to you is Dublin are ranked at 9, Clare are ranked far higher. 14 men or no 14 men, Laois could have beaten a team ranked a fair bit higher than Dublin, and I would have been very confident that if they played again, that it would have been a really tight game. It would have been far more similar to the Port-Laois game of 2019 than that kind of, they kept it tight, but it was an annihilation realistically. I'm saying there would have only been 3-4 points between the two of them if they played again.
Not a hope. There'd have been 8+. And another thing, would Laois have brought Kilkenny back from 16 points behind? I don't think so.
No, probably not. But I'm still saying Dublin are slightly ahead of Laois. I'm not saying that Laois are ahead of Dublin. I just think they would have been a lot tighter if they played again. Good to see that you have your Dublin hat on early in this conversation, and the colours will change as we get a little bit higher.
By the way, I must point out this is a joint list between us. We've had to do a small bit of horse trading here, and you could make an argument that Dublin could be higher up, but then again, the way they played against Cork, it's probably hard to do so. That's not to say I don't think that they couldn't beat Wexford or Cork on another day or what have you. But look, we have to go with what we see. Right, we'll go back into the list again and put in a couple more. We've got Cork at 8 and we've got Wexford at 7, which means there's plenty of teams higher up than them. I think Cork people will be pretty upset to see their team down at number 8. But then again, what they've been served up this season, probably hard for them to argue too hard.
Well, if you're looking at it, I'm kind of only thinking on the spot here now. If you're speaking through farm lines, the team that beat them well in the Munster semi-final are now in the All-Ireland final. So there's a decent farm line there. They fronted up against Dublin. There was a good performance against Dublin. For 60 minutes against Tipperary, they delivered a good performance, and it looked like they were going to maybe kick on. They didn't kick on. It's the same old story. They won one match this year, and that's against a team ranked number 9. So I don't think, and I'm basing it on this year, and of course we're probably basing it on last year as well. The same old kind of failings with Cork. Kind of hard to have them much higher than this. When you have Wexford at 7, fair enough. Wexford had an awful year this year. No point in saying any different. They were hammered in their 2 games, but at least Wexford have the Bob O'Keefe from 2019. They have something in the locker. I think that's the only thing that just puts them marginally ahead of Cork for me. That's the only thing.
Yeah, but so many of their players were so far off form. You had a manager who was talking about them putting up the white flag. Can we really talk about a team that won that title 17 months ago now? Can we really, Cork at least won a game and looked relatively good doing it against Dublin. Like their pace, their work rate, everything was really good that day.
Yeah, I don't know. Wexford was nearly too bad to be true, isn't it? It's just like, how do you compare 2019 with 2020? They're just like, they're poles apart. When you look at the amount of guys that played probably to, a really, really high level in 19, and you couldn't really say anybody played to even, halfway up to that scale. It's probably debatable between the two of these, which could be 8 and which could be 7. The fact that we know Wexford have maybe done it a bit more recently against really, really good opposition and beaten a Kilkenny in a Leinster final, and obviously but were within a point or two of an All-Ireland final in 19. That's all that's keeping them ahead, because it was an awful, awful 2020.
Yeah, I mean, Cork are the typical Jekyll and Hyde team. They've got a couple of Munster titles in recent seasons. 2018 they pushed Limerick all the way. 20 in the All-Ireland semi-final. 2019 they beat them in the Munster Championship, but lost to Clare. So then you can see why Clare will be higher up, plus Clare's performances this year. Cork are very, very hard one to read, because then the flip side is Wexford. Two of their last 3 seasons they've been a flop, haven't they? 2018 they were a bit of a flop, and everyone was talking about should Davy stay on and all this kind of stuff. We're at a crossroads. People aren't listening to the message anymore, and all the comparisons with Jose Mourinho. But he turned it around and won that Leinster title. But two of the 3 seasons, most recently, haven't been great. Whereas if you were to add up the 3 seasons, you could argue that Cork have beaten better teams, and Wexford also, when the chance was there. 2019 All-Ireland semi-final against Tipperary, down to 14 men, and they couldn't see it through. So both teams have got their flaws, and both teams have their plus points.
Without a doubt, you're probably saying that both teams blew an All-Ireland semi-final in recent years. Cork blowing the lead against Limerick, and Wexford blowing it with an extra man again, blowing a lead as well against Tipperary last year. Both down the bottom end. You'd be expecting, like, Davy in his 5th year, like, this is it. Like, they have to produce something next year. And I'm not sure that sort of pressure. We were kind of thinking that we're going to produce something this year, and they didn't produce anything. It's kind of when we're thinking they're not going to produce anything, they do, and when we're expecting something, they don't. And obviously, Kieran Kingston's 2nd term in Cork, like, got off to a really kind of inauspicious kind of start. Really, does he know anything more at the end of this year than he did coming in? We don't. They don't have a 3. They don't have a 6. I would be expecting a good few changes there. Otherwise, you can't, like, as good as some of those older faces are, you can't keep going back to the same old faces if you have the same old failings.
Yeah. Okay, we'll move on to the list again. Number 6 is Clare, and number 5 is Kilkenny. And we'll I think straight away Kilkenny folk are going to be pretty unhappy to see their team down in 5th there.
They probably are. The two
All-Ireland final last year, Leinster title this year, All-Ireland semi-final.
There's 3 teams ahead of them that didn't win any silverware this year, and they obviously have silverware in their hands this year. But I think when you take it overall, like, they were brilliant against Dublin for a half. Like, I don't know what you say. You can't. I think when you look back at the Waterford game now, you'd say, did Kilkenny switch off in the second half against Dublin? No, probably not. You'd probably say they capitulated a bit, like maybe they did the other night. They were just totally overpowered by Waterford in the semi-final. They were totally overpowered by Dublin in the second half. Did they hurl well against Galway? Not particularly. They kept in the game, and it was kind of the wily kind of Kilkenny kind of cuteness maybe that brought them over the line. And then you're thinking going into a semi-final, Kilkenny won Leinster final here. They're only at half speed, and there's loads of improvements to come, but they didn't really come, and the over-reliance on TJ Reid probably came to roost again. So that's why, and like, they were beaten 4 points by Waterford, but they were beaten well by Waterford. Really, like, on the hour mark, realistically, you're thinking, unless Kilkenny produce something unbelievable here, that this game is over. So that's why I have them at 5. Just your own thoughts on Kilkenny there as well, why they're not higher up.
Yeah, it is that whole thing. I think when I watch back some of that game against Waterford, I kind of realised, like, the half back line, there's nothing fearsome about it, and Waterford were able to dominate it, and Jack Fagan was brilliant, and Stephen Bennett was brilliant, and Austin Gleeson was able to bully them. And only for Conor Delaney was able to keep into Desi Hutchinson to some degree, and Hutchinson still played well. You just wonder, who are the guys, especially under the ages of 30, that are really going to lead this Kilkenny team? And is any sort of fear that was there of that team kind of gone now? And it's not a case of saying stuff like that to wind up Kilkenny supporters. They know themselves, this isn't a fearsome team. And there's not, like, who's the TJ Reid coming through? Now, there's a couple of guys underage, and like Brian Cody has said himself, there's always hurlers there, and no doubt there are, but are there generational type players coming through? I mean, in 2 or 3 years things could change around massively, but like, Limerick, Waterford, these have players who are of good ages that are going to be there for another 2 or 3, 4 years at their peak ages. Whereas you couldn't say that with Kilkenny, that they've guys who are 22, 23, 24 that are ready to kick on to the next level. So I think the game against Dublin, once Dublin actually put scoring forwards on and played a sweeper, Kilkenny didn't know how to deal with it. I think once Waterford settled into playing in Croke Park, their first appearance there this year versus Kilkenny's third, they rose to the occasion and completely overwhelmed Kilkenny. Galway, I mean, they did really well to edge that victory. But after 53 minutes, their starting forwards had scored 3 points. So, like, TJ Reid is carrying the mantle massively there, and he's 33, and how much longer can he do it? So that's why power rankings, it's kind of looking back at the last couple of years, and like they've had some big wins by beating Galway, by beating Limerick in the All-Ireland semi-final last year. But still in all, if they were to take on the teams ahead of them a few more times, and you could make a fair case that they should be ahead of Galway here. You definitely can. But I still think Tipperary would beat them if they met right now. I still think Limerick would beat them if they met them right now. I think last year, bit of an outlier to some degree, great performance and all that. There was the sideline at the end and all that. How would Kilkenny have done in extra time? We've talked about the few collapses in the last few years. So I can understand if a Kilkenny supporter would be upset with that. But still in all, we've laid out our case, and we both blindly picked it, and we both had them at 5. So it's not like, and obviously you as an Offaly man, you defer to Kilkenny on all things. So it's certainly not any bias on your behalf. But also, I have you something to add on that, or do you want to talk about
No,
Clare?
just I suppose probably in 2020, Adrian Mullen been missing was the big one. He was a player that could have offered a bit of an X factor. But when you look back at the really commanding Kilkenny teams, as you say, there's no Tommy Walsh's, there's no Brian Hogan's, there's no JJ Delaney's, there's no fearsome half back line. And if anything, like the Waterford half back line was really fearsome, and Kilkenny couldn't break them down the other night in the second half at all. Waterford did to Kilkenny what Kilkenny have been doing to teams for years the other night. They bullied them in the sky, they dominated their half back line, and they were able to take them on at pace. And it's going to be interesting to see what Kilkenny can do over the next couple of years. The only thing I will say is, winning a Leinster for a lot of those young lads, I think will have a good bounce over the next couple of years. Billy Ryan, Owen Cody, Mossy Keown, all these guys, Conor Delaney, really, this is really their first probably championship season playing and being a regular kind of starter. So I do think that will have a nice bounce for them. We've talked all about Kilkenny here. Clare are at 6 as well. When I was looking at it, would Brian Lohan have been happy if they were in an All-Ireland quarter-final at the start of the year? Publicly, he wouldn't be happy. Privately, I'd say he probably would have been happy, given the personnel that they were missing, and we've named them so many times now at this stage. And they got to an All-Ireland quarter-final, have been fairly well beaten by Limerick. It was a decent performance, but they bounced back well, got a win over Wexford, who they deservedly should be ahead of in the rankings as a result of, and caused Waterford some trouble. Maybe the legs kind of weighing in the last, 20, 25 minutes. Tony Kelly been injured. It's funny, some people saying that there was some commentary saying that Kelly was moving perfectly after he was injured that day against Waterford. He's since in a boot. He's in a protective boot, so that'll show you that he was clearly injured that day and clearly wasn't himself. If he had been himself, it would have been even more interesting. But I think they went down fighting this year, in fairness to them, even without who they were missing.
Yeah, no, I'd agree with that. And if they can get those players back in that were injured, Colin Galvin, John Conlon, who had been back training in recent times, then you kind of feel like for once, I'm not going to be, sort of putting down Clare. I'm going to be thinking, right, there's prospects here, because Jason McCarthy was good against Wexford, for example, in midfield. Maybe more can be done with him. And it's not like he's just come on the scene. We've seen a couple of flashes of him before. And can Ian Galvin come back? Can he play well? Obviously,
Rory Hayes as well was a nice find, wasn't he? Rory Hayes is a nice find at cornerback too. They've had to find a couple of players now as a result of this, which is good, And
Aaron Shanahan, if he can stay fit. I'm not sure there's a bit of an echo there.
Another threat, yeah.
Do something turned on there.
They've definitely got more options. Definitely got more options now than they had coming into the year anyway. So they just need to try and merge. Playing the long game with Colin Galvin and him missing this year should work out over the next couple of years. And John Conlon maybe not been rushed back this year and possibly injuring himself. That should benefit them in the long term as well. Conlon probably the next 2-3 years probably going to be the swan song of his inter-county career. So you'll be hoping that he comes back seriously fit, and Clare can make kind of a big charge over the next couple of years.
I think there was a small bit of an echo there at one stage. So Not sure if you have a speaker on or something, but hopefully that goes away. Anyway, we'll plough on. So number 4 and number 3, we've gone with Tipperary at number 4, grudgingly, and Galway at number 3. Are you going to stand by this? I don't feel great about this at all. I obviously had to accept it because in the head-to-head, Galway did win the game, but I'm not really sure that I agree with this.
Yeah, no, I totally stand over this. Galway are far more consistent throughout the year. They obviously wiped the floor with Wexford in their first game. And they obviously lost the Leinster final, and that's probably a bit of a caveat to it. But they hurled Kilkenny up a stick for the guts of an hour. They bounced back then, obviously against Tipperary. Interesting to see now. Probably, I wonder if Cottle Barrett's red card was probably the big kind of difference in this. But the thing I'd add to it is they obviously did beat Tipperary. They also kind of fronted up against Limerick as well. Now Limerick were the authors of their own, it wasn't a downfall, but they kept the game tighter than it should have been. But this is a Galway side that really went down fighting and were level with Limerick after 75 minutes, despite the best hurler they've probably ever had been off the field in Joe Canning, and Cottle Mannion been off after 23 minutes. So. And I kind of put it to this as well. Who do I think would give Limerick a better game at the moment? Based on this year, Galway definitely would. If you compare the two results, Tip's result against Limerick and Galway's result against Limerick, and the fact that Galway have beaten Tip, I think Galway edged in number 3 for me.
So even before we even talk about whether Galway should be ahead of Tip or vice versa, have both of them shown sufficient weaknesses to say that Kilkenny are stronger than them?
I wouldn't think so. I still think if Tip played Kilkenny and Galway played Kilkenny, I think Tip and Galway win probably 7 out of 6 to 7 out of those games. I'd imagine. And one of obviously when Kilkenny met Galway, that's kind of one of those 3 or 4 that they would lose because they obviously came out. They obviously came out on the wrong side after being ahead for about 60 minutes. But I still think on the balance of play, Galway and Tip probably have probably more dangers up front, and I'd probably just have a few kind of more powerhouses, I would say, around the field than Kilkenny have. If you're looking at Galway, they obviously have Concannon and Whelan now, not just reliant on Canning. The two Mannions as well, even like Dottie Burke. I'm not sure if Kilkenny have those type of players, those real big marquee players outside of TJ Reid at the moment.
Yeah, I think from Tipperary's point of view, they can be ahead of Kilkenny in this ranking by virtue of recent meetings. I think being All-Ireland champions, as we're talking, and even winning that by 14 points, and then there was obviously the final in 2016, winning by 9 points. And Kilkenny haven't won an All-Ireland in 5 years, and Tipperary have 2, and obviously have the under-20 and under-21 All-Ireland successes of the past couple of years. I think all of those things combined, you still have Tipperary ahead. And to some degree, I'd put Tipperary ahead of Galway for the same reason, and add into that as well that the red card did change that game. It changes games, we know that. And Tipperary still beat Wexford last year, being down to 14 men, but some days you can't get over the line. So I think, and people say, oh, well, Kilkenny lost in All-Ireland going down to 14 men. That's fine, but there's a difference between losing with 14 men and losing with 14 points. So I think you'd have to add in that into the mix. So I have Tipperary ahead of Kilkenny, even though, the 3 of those teams, there's all an element of transition has to happen there. Tipperary probably need to bring through a couple of those All-Ireland under 2021 players. Galway probably now need to look at transitioning in a couple of newer players, especially if they're going to persist with a sweeper. They need to bring more energy into the forward line, and we saw, we obviously reviewed it. You can watch back the review show and see how we talked about that Galway team. And
I just say crucially, Shane, something you said there is Tip have those players to bring through, and I think that's another reason why I put them ahead of Kilkenny. No, I'm just saying that they have proven All-Ireland under 21 winners, proven All-Ireland under 20 winners. Kilkenny have a couple of Leinster titles, but their under 20 side came up short against Cork, a Cork side that came up well short against Tipperary in the final. I just think Tipperary have a greater kind of range of talent coming through. Tipperary have a lot of guys. That's not to say Kilkenny don't have guys coming through. Of course they do. But I just think I think Tipperary have a better spread of guys coming through. More guys that you think could potentially break onto that team, and a couple of guys that could be potential superstars.
At the same time, Kilkenny are maybe 2 or 3 years into this whole transition, and they're still searching for those players, aren't they? It's when I said there's no obvious superstars to come through, and who knows, somebody could surprise you. But they've tried so many players. I think it'd be interesting to even count up the amount of players. Like I can think of like a myriad of wing forwards who've been tried in the last 3 or 4 years, and defenders. He's got Brian Cody's gone through an awful lot of players to try and find that next generation. And what he's currently got is a team that they won a Leinster title, but Waterford did show up an awful lot of shortcomings in that team. But like Tipperary have their shortcomings, there's no doubt about it. And certainly Galway do too. They both look like teams short on that bit of energy, whereas Kilkenny maybe looked like they were short on a bit of quality and maybe a little bit of size. We'll move on to the next part of the rankings, which is number 2 and 1. And I think people will probably have seen these coming a mile off. Waterford number 2 and Limerick number 1. It's probably going to be hard to have it any other way.
It probably was, yeah. If you look at it, if we'd done this power rankings this time last year, like there was people saying last year, I thought this was far-fetched at the time now even, but they were saying that, if Kerry played Waterford for that bottom spot in Munster, that they could potentially beat them. And I never thought that would happen, being honest with you. That's not been disingenuous to Kerry. But and now they're number 2. And they're going into the All-Ireland final with a really, really live chance. It's amazing how things can be turned around. I think sometimes the whole manager thing can be overplayed and over-egged. I don't think in this instance it can be overplayed or over-egged. Like Liam Cahill and Mikey Beaver and Stephen Frampton and the rest of the backroom team have come in here and turned Waterford upside down. They look like a different side completely. They look like a side like that just are based on different principles now. It's just work everywhere, in your face. High energy, high action, loads of really mobile, fast players who can play it on the ground, and have the Jack Fagans, Kevin Mourns, Tyke de Bourke, Caleb Lyons that can play it up high as well. And I think they've got a lovely blend. Like Waterford, I think Cahill probably looked at Limerick and thought, okay, what do we need to compete with the elite of the elite now? I said, we need really mobile players, load of athleticism, we need a load of versatility and adaptability all over the pitch. Now they have guys that can play in loads of different positions, and they can kind of move pieces in here and there, and it's been an amazing turnaround in 12 to 15 months.
I'm going to play a small bit. I'll put out a little cheeky one, a bit of devil's advocate and what have you, but we'll run with this idea. Are Waterford, after taking a step up to the next level, in spite of this year not using Noel Connors and Maurice Shanahan, not having Philip Mahoney available because he decided to retire from Intercounty, and Pádraig Mahoney obviously got injured, are they getting to an All-Ireland final in spite of that, or almost because the changeover from not having those experienced players means that all those other guys have come through and gotten the experience? Are they better off with the new ones is kind of the question I'm asking.
No, I think they've got there in spite of them. Now that obviously there's Shanahan and Connors, not to be disingenuous to those guys, but Cahill obviously deemed them surplus to requirements. I think, based on Philip Mahoney's performances with Ballygunner over the last couple of years, I'm sure he would have loved to have him. And Pádraig Mahoney as well, obviously reliable free taker and a mobile player as well, very, very mobile player, despite that kind of leg break a couple of years ago. So I think it's more in spite of being without those players than anything else. And if you look, I think he's probably, what do most good managers do? They try and value the squad, every squad member as much as possible, and basically when someone is out, like Jim Gavin always said, it's next man up, and I think that's the way he's painted it. You haven't heard him giving out about who he's missing or bemoaning who he's missing or anything like that. I just think he's tried to have his 36 players ready to go. If any gap needs to be filled, that all 36 will be ready to go. And by all accounts, like, who would have said Ian Kenny's probably going to start an All-Ireland final, a couple of months ago? Would have been very, very unlikely. Interesting if Shane Fives comes back into the mix there, if he's back fit. Don't know if they'd parachute him back in. But there's been a lot of guys that Cahill has just trusted there, and they've repaid that trust in spades.
Yeah, and just looking at the list again, which I have up on screen, Waterford are ahead of Galway, Tipperary, Kilkenny, Clare, Wexford, Cork, Dublin. Like, I think Tipperary in the last 10 years have roundly beaten Waterford and beaten them well. But of course Tipperary's form is such that you can't really have them ahead of them despite being All-Ireland champions. I think Galway traditionally would have fancied themselves against Waterford also, even though there's a couple of reversals there. But as a Tipperary person, there was a window where Waterford beat Tipperary there during maybe the noughties and up to 2008. But Tipperary generally beat Waterford, so as a Tipperary person, you might be a little bit like, well, I'm unsure of this. It's just that form of Waterford lately. You couldn't make a case to not have them up at number 2.
No, it's like this. If Waterford were playing Tip in the morning, I think you'd be worried. I think you'd be worried by the amount of pace that they could bring to the table, and maybe not Tip's perceived lack of pace, but they definitely don't have that same pace as Waterford have. You'd be hoping that the Tip shooters and the riskier kind of lads would go to town. I'd be having looked at the All-Ireland semi-final last night and even looked at, or the other night, and looked at the Ulster final as well, I'd be worried that from a Tip point of view, that a lot of those kind of guys could potentially get gobbled up and just would not have the time on the ball. It would be an interesting mix. It would be a really interesting mix. But at this moment in time, I have no problem in saying that I'd have Waterford ahead of Tip and Galway.
And Limerick are at number one for an obvious enough reasons. I mean, they're all things to all men. They can play summer hurling in the winter. They can dog it out with you in the winter if they want. And they, like, back-to-back Munster champions, All-Ireland champions the previous year, back-to-back league champions. Outside of that, do you think this list would be much different if we were after looking at a summer All-Ireland?
Good question. Potentially Cork could be a bit higher, because I still think, no matter what people have said, that winter conditions didn't really suit them, particularly games in the rain and things like that definitely didn't suit them. After summer All-Ireland, probably Tip potentially could be a bit higher as well, I'd say, just because it's not just speed of movement, but it's, speed of hand and everything in kind of summer conditions. Those, maybe the sort of player like Bubbles would have featured in the summer if he was fitter. He probably wasn't going to feature in this winter championship too much. But I don't know if it would have changed too much. I don't know if the top two would have changed anyway.
Would Kilkenny be higher? I mean, Colin Fennelly was an all-star last year. He's a player that has done so well in the winter with Ballyhale that you kind of think it doesn't really matter what the season is for him, but he ends up being captain and then he's dropped. Would he have gone better in the summer? Would Wally Walsh have gone better in the summer? I mean, yeah, it's very, very hard to say. Obviously, it's just conjecture, but is there a team that's higher up there because it's a winter All-Ireland, do you reckon?
I don't think so, no. And funnily enough, and that was a big debate point before we started, we were thinking, okay, who's it going to suit? To be fair, I think we said before anything started that Limerick were a team for every season, and that they were most likely still going to be All-Ireland champions at the end of the year, regardless of the conditions. We thought it would suit Galway. It's funny to say we thought it would suit Galway because of their big, strong, kind of physically imposing players, and yet physically they were probably not blown out of the water by Limerick, but their lack of mobility maybe by some players was kind of shown up the other night. And that's in the Winter All-Ireland on the last weekend in November. So I think when games are played in Croke Park, I don't think it matters half as much. Played in provincial venues, even some of the games down in Limerick earlier on this year when underfoot conditions were quite soft, Tip and Galway down there as well, a lot of lads slipping and sliding. You didn't see that half as much in Croke Park the other night. And even if lads were sliding, it was just because it was greasy. But there's no big tufts of ground like that coming out. It's not soft. They're summer conditions in the winter. So, no, I don't think it would have changed too much, to be honest.
Yeah, so the two teams that are at the top, both of them have performed throughout the year. Limerick went down to horrendous conditions in Cork against Tipperary, one against Clare handy in Thurles. Held off a really good Waterford challenge in Thurles also. Then they've been up in Croke Park, been impressive. So you couldn't not have them at number one. And Waterford clearly number two based on their performances. Beating Cork well, performing really well against the Limerick team that has beaten the snot out of everyone else. And then that pulsating win against Kilkenny, where I think they had to acclimatise just to Croke Park for some of those players. So that's the height of it. We'll do it again after the All-Ireland. Oh, do you have a little final point?
No, just on Limerick, like anyone, there can be no debate that they're number one. They're back-to-back league champions, undefeated throughout this year's league, back-to-back Munster champions, and unlike last year where they were beaten 3 times, they haven't been beaten yet. The question I'd have for you is, will our power rankings be different if we discuss this in 2 weeks' time?
That's the thing.
You're not giving